The gardenias smelled like dying sweetness. Heavy, oppressive, each breath coating Jasmine's throat like liquid silk turning to poison. Her fingers, painted in the soft blush pink Philip had insisted, matched her skin tone, trembled around the cascading white orchids in her bouquet, their petals already wilting in the June heat. The string quartet's bows had frozen mid-stroke 3 minutes ago, leaving only the sound of 200 guests shifting uncomfortably in their gilt chairs, their designer gowns rustling like 1,000 whispered judgments. Before we continue, I just want to pause and say thank you for being here. If Jasmine's story is already pulling at your heartstrings, I'd love for you to join our community. We are working toward 1,000 subscribers, and your support is what keeps these stories going. If you have a second, please subscribe and drop a comment below. I love seeing where you guys are watching from. Okay, let's find out what happens next. He's not under the arch, Jas. Bonnie's voice cut through the haze, her hand squeezing Jasmine's shoulder, her maid of honor, her college roommate, her sister in everything but blood. Jasmine shook her head, the crystals in her hair catching the afternoon sun and throwing fractured light across the white runner that stretched endlessly before her. He's just nervous, the traffic from the hotel. Look at your dress, Bonnie whispered, and there was something broken in her voice. Look at what you're wearing. Jasmine glanced down. The custom Galia Lahav corset gown clung to every curve of her hourglass frame, the ivory lace so intricate it had taken 6 months to complete, the bodice pressed against her ribs like a beautiful cage, the boning digging into her olive skin with each shallow breath. She'd skipped meals for 2 weeks to fit into this dress. Philip had told her she looked like a goddess during the final fitting. Now it felt like a costume for a role she'd never auditioned for. Just give him 5 more minutes, Jasmine heard herself say, though her voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. Maybe his phone died. Maybe. The best man appeared at the edge of her vision. Young, pale, walking toward her like a man approaching an execution. In his hands was not a bouquet, not a note, but a tablet, its screen glowing obscenely bright in the natural light. "Miss Mansion," he stammered, and he wouldn't meet her eyes. "Philip asked me to God. I'm so sorry. He said you needed to see this." The tablet was cold when he pressed it into her hands. The bouquet fell to the grass, forgotten. The screen showed a live stream. Not a blank screen, not a frozen image. A live feed. Philip, not in a car, not stuck in traffic. Philip, in the cabin of a private jet, champagne flute in hand, his Tom Ford tuxedo jacket draped carelessly over the seat beside him. Behind him, she could see boxes, white boxes, with her company's logo stamped in gold. Mansion Couture. Her grandmother's legacy. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at someone off-screen, laughing. Then he turned, looked directly into the lens, directly at her. "Jasmine," Philip's voice, came through the tablet speaker, smooth and casual, like he was leaving a voicemail about dinner plans. "If you're seeing this, you're probably standing in that dress right now, the one I told you to wear. I need you to understand something. This was never about love. It was about access." The word access echoed in Jasmine's skull like a death knell. Around her, the estate had gone deathly silent. Even the fountain behind the floral arch seemed to stop flowing. Philip continued speaking, his smile widening on the screen, and every word felt like a blade sliding between her ribs. "The archive vault. Your grandmother's original designs. The patents. The trade secrets. I've had the codes for 3 hours now. Cracked them this morning while you were getting your hair done. By the time you watch this, the designs are sold to Laurent Mercier, the accounts are frozen, and Mansion Couture's intellectual property, well, it's not yours anymore." The word hit her like a slap. Yours. She'd spent 2 years with this man. 2 years that now felt like a elaborate con. A long game she hadn't even known she was playing. It had started so differently, so innocently. She could still remember the night they met 3 years ago at the Metropolitan Fashion Gala, back when her grandmother had just passed and Jasmine was drowning in grief and the crushing pressure of keeping a legacy brand alive. Philip had approached her at the bar, charming and polished in his perfectly tailored Armani, and told her he'd been following her work for years. He was a venture capitalist, he said, specializing in heritage brands. He understood the pressure she was under. He wanted to help. The first 6 months had been careful, professional. He'd taken her to dinners where he asked thoughtful questions about her design process, about her grandmother's techniques, about the archive vault that housed the original sketches, the holy grail of Mansion Couture. Jasmine had been so grateful to finally have someone who understood the weight she carried, Someone who didn't just see her as a CEO or a designer, but as a woman trying to honor her family's name. When he'd kissed her for the first time, standing in her studio surrounded by fabric samples and half-finished sketches, she'd felt like maybe, just maybe, she could have both the business and the love story. What a fool she'd been. Philip hadn't loved her. He'd studied her. He'd spent 2 years learning her patterns, her passwords, her security protocols. He'd asked gentle questions about the vault's locking mechanism, about which sketches were original versus reproductions, about her grandmother's signature techniques that made mansion couture impossible to replicate. She'd thought he was being supportive, building a life with her. He'd been casing a heist. Every late-night studio session where he brought her espresso and rubbed her shoulders. Every time he'd offered to handle the administrative side so she could focus on creating. Every intimate moment where she'd let her guard down and trusted him with the keys to her kingdom. It had all been a performance. "I know you'll be upset." Philip's voice continued from the tablet, pulling her back to the present horror. His tone was almost sympathetic, almost kind, and that made it so much worse. "But you have to admit, it's impressive. 2 years of groundwork. Do you know how hard it is to pretend to care about fabric swatches? Anyway," he raised his glass toward the camera in a mock toast. "Thanks for the access, sweetheart. The jet's about to take off. Don't bother calling. I've already changed my number. Oh, and the venue? The flowers? The catering? All charged to your corporate card this morning. Consider it my exit fee." The screen went black. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick and terrible. Then came the murmurs, soft at first, then building 200 guests, including every major name in fashion journalism, every investor she'd courted for the new collection, every designer she'd mentored, all of them watching her humiliation in real time. The botanical estate suddenly felt like a coliseum, and she was the spectacle. Jasmine's fingers went numb. The tablet slipped from her hands, hitting the grass with a muted thump. She could hear fragments of whispered conversations. Stolen. Bankruptcy. How could she not know? And each word felt like a stone thrown at her back. The makeup artist had spent 90 minutes on her face this morning, contouring and highlighting until her amber eyes glowed and her olive skin looked luminous. She'd wanted to feel beautiful. For once in her life, she'd wanted to be more than the CEO, more than the designer, more than her grandmother's prodigy. She'd wanted to be a bride. The first tear broke free, hot and humiliating, carving a path through the foundation that had cost more than some people's monthly rent. "Jas," Bonnie started, reaching for her, but Jasmine stepped back, shaking her head. "I need to, I can't." She turned toward the side exit, desperate to escape the staring guests and clicking phones and investors who were probably already calculating how fast they could pull their funding. Then the doors at the back of the estate exploded open. Not creaked, not drifted. Exploded the antique pergola doors slamming against the limestone walls with a crack that echoed across the grounds like a gunshot. Every head in the venue turned. The man who entered didn't hurry. He moved like time itself had slowed to accommodate him. Each step deliberate and unhurried. He was tall, broader in the shoulders than Philip, wearing a suit so dark it looked like it had been cut from midnight. His hair was swept back, revealing a face that was all brutal elegance, sharp cheekbones and a jaw shadowed with stubble that looked intentional. But it was his presence that stole the air from the space. Dangerous. He looked dangerous the way a hurricane looks beautiful. Something you couldn't look away from even as your instincts screamed to run. 2 men in dark suits flanked him, their hands clasped in front of them, eyes scanning the crowd with cold efficiency, but no one was looking at them. Jasmine's breath caught. She didn't know him. She was certain of that. And yet there was something in the way he moved, something in the set of his shoulders, that pulled at a memory she couldn't quite grasp. The stranger's eyes locked onto Jasmine from across the expanse of white carpet. Dark eyes so dark they were almost black, and they burned with an intensity that made her knees weak. He walked down the aisle toward her. The guests parted without being asked, pressing themselves back against their chairs as he passed. Jasmine couldn't move. Her heels felt rooted to the grass. The stranger stopped 5 feet away. Up close, she could see the tattoo's geometric ink rising from his collar, disappearing beneath the crisp white shirt. Not crude gang symbols, but precise, almost architectural, like blueprints or ancient crests. He smelled like sandalwood and tobacco and something darker she couldn't name. Jasmine Mansion. His voice was low, rough, the kind that didn't need to be raised to command a room. It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation. She managed a barely perceptible nod, her throat completely dry. The stranger's gaze flicked down to the shattered tablet on the grass, then back to her face. Something shifted in his expression, not pity, but recognition. Like he'd been expecting this. Like he'd been waiting for this. Then he turned to face the crowd, his broad shoulders blocking Jasmine from view, shielding her from 200 staring eyes. "The groom," he said, his voice carrying across the stunned silence with absolute authority, "is irrelevant. Proceed." The officiant stood frozen under the floral arch, his prayer book trembling in his hands. Dante didn't acknowledge him. His dark eyes remained fixed on Jasmine, studying her with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare despite the layers of lace covering her body. The sirens in the distance grew louder, then abruptly stopped. Someone had made a call. Someone had enormous power. And that someone was standing close enough that Jasmine could feel the heat radiating from his body despite the June sun beating down on them both. "Breathe," Dante said, his voice dropping to a register so low only she could hear it. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command wrapped in dark velvet, and her lungs obeyed before her mind could catch up. She drew in a shuddering breath, and with it came his scent, sandalwood and rain and expensive tobacco, the kind that came in wooden humidors and cost a fortune. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. He stepped closer, closing the space between them until she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. This close, she could see the fine lines at the corners of those dark eyes, could see the shadow of stubble along his jaw. We could see the geometric tattoo that disappeared beneath his collar, intricate lines and angles that looked less like decoration and more like a map to something ancient and forbidden. "You don't know me," Jasmine managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Her throat felt raw, stripped by the tears she was fighting to hold back. "Why would you—" "I know enough." Dante's hand moved, slow and deliberate, and for a heart-stopping moment she thought he was going to touch her face. Instead, he reached past her and picked up the shattered tablet from the grass, its screen still flickering with the frozen image of Philip's smug smile. "I know Philip Ellison has been moving merchandise through my ports for the last 6 months. Designer knockoffs, mostly. Cheap reproductions of high-end pieces that he's been selling to discount chains overseas." He held up the tablet so she could see Philip's face one more time, then let it drop back to the ground. "I know he needed access to your archive to make those reproductions perfect enough to fool customs. And I know that in approximately 45 minutes, his jet will be in international airspace, and your company's designs will be in the hands of Laurent Mercier, who will flood the market with counterfeits before you can even file an injunction." Jasmine's chest constricted. The corset suddenly felt like it was crushing her ribcage. "How do you—" "I control the shipping lanes along the entire eastern seaboard," Dante said, and there was no boast in his voice, just cold fact. "Every container that moves through my ports, I know what's in it. Every manifest, every bill of lading, every customs declaration. I've been watching Philip for months, waiting to see what he was building toward. When I received the invitation to this wedding from the Mansion Family Trust, I understood." His eyes darkened, and something shifted in his expression, something that looked almost like regret. "I should have stopped him sooner. I didn't realize how close he was to the vault." "The family trust invited you?" Jasmine's mind was reeling, trying to process too much information at once. Her grandmother had established that trust decades ago, a network of old-world families who had helped build the fashion empire from nothing. She'd always thought it was ceremonial, a relic of her grandmother's generation. "Why would they—" "Because our families have an alliance that goes back 3 generations, Dante said, "and because I made a promise to protect the Mansion bloodline." He paused, his jaw tightening. "But I'm not here out of obligation, Jasmine. I'm here because I can give you a choice that Philip never did." The word choice felt like a trap. Jasmine took a step back, her heel sinking into the soft grass, but Dante didn't follow. He simply extended his hand toward her, palm up, and she could see the scars across his knuckles, old wounds, healed but never forgotten. "Marry me," he said, and his voice carried across the silent estate like a vow. "Right now, in front of all these witnesses. My legal team will freeze Philip's assets before his jet leaves the tarmac. We'll void the sale to Mercier, reclaim your archive, and restore every dollar he stole from your accounts." He tilted his head slightly, and the sunlight caught the tattoo on his neck, making the geometric lines seem to move like living ink. "Or walk away, spend the next 5 years in court battles you can't afford, watching your grandmother's legacy get torn apart by lawyers and liquidators. The choice is yours." Jasmine looked at his outstretched hand, then at the empty floral arch where Philip should have been standing. Behind her, she could hear Bonnie's sharp intake of breath, could feel 200 pairs of eyes boring into her back. She thought about the archive, her grandmother's original sketches, the patents that had taken decades to develop, the trade secrets that made Mansion Couture impossible to replicate. She thought about Philip's laugh as he boarded that jet, so casual, so certain that he'd won. And she thought about the fact that this stranger, this dangerous man with his dark eyes and darker promises, was offering her something Philip never had. Not love, not romance, but power. Agency, a future that wasn't defined by what she'd lost. Her hand moved before her mind fully processed the decision. She placed her palm against Dante's, and his fingers closed around hers, warm, strong, completely certain. The touch sent electricity racing up her arm, and she had to lock her knees to keep from swaying. Dante's eyes flared with something she couldn't name, and then he was turning, pulling her gently toward the floral arch at the end of the aisle, his grip firm but not painful. "Proceed," he said again to the officiant, and this time it wasn't a suggestion. The ceremony was a blur of sacred words that felt profane and binding promises that felt like business contracts. Jasmine heard herself repeating vows in a voice that didn't sound like her own, felt Dante's hand slide a platinum band onto her finger that was still warm from his pocket, tasted copper when she bit her lip to keep from crying when the officiant pronounced them husband and wife. Dante didn't kiss her. He simply pressed his forehead to hers for one long silent moment, his breath mingling with hers, and whispered, "You're safe now." 20 minutes later, Jasmine stood in a private room off the estate's main hall, staring at a stack of papers spread across an antique desk. Dante's lawyers, 3 men in identical dark suits who had appeared like shadows, stood on one side. Bonnie hovered near the door, her face pale. And Dante leaned against the window, his jacket unbuttoned, watching Jasmine with those unreadable eyes. "This is the standard asset protection agreement," one of the lawyers said, sliding a document toward her. "It outlines the division of property in the event of—" "No." Jasmine's voice cut through the room like a blade. She didn't touch the papers. "I'm not signing a prenup." The lawyer blinked. "Mrs. Pisani, I understand this is overwhelming, but—" "I said no." Jasmine lifted her chin. Even though her hands were shaking, she had nothing left. No leverage, no power, no cards to play. But she wouldn't sign away what little dignity remained. "I won't be legally bound to protect his assets while mine are still frozen." "Jasmine." Dante pushed off the window and crossed to the desk in 3 long strides. He picked up the papers, all of them, and held them out to her. But when she reached for them, he didn't let go. "Read page 7. Section 3. Her eyes scanned the dense legal text. Once, then again, because it didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. "This says you're transferring your assets into my name. All of them. The ports. The holdings. The—" She looked up at him, her amber eyes wide with confusion and something close to fear. "This says I control everything." "Yes." Dante's expression didn't change. "Philip wanted you to be a victim. I need you to be a vault." He released the papers, letting them flutter back to the desk. "My enemies have been trying to seize my assets for years. They'll never think to look for them in the accounts of a fashion CEO they've never heard of. You hold the power, Jasmine, not me. That's the deal." Jasmine stared at him, her mind spinning. This wasn't protection. This was a weapon he'd just placed in her hands. "You're insane," she whispered. "Probably," Dante agreed. And for the first time, something that might have been a smile touched his lips. "Sign the papers. Become the most dangerous woman in the city, or don't, and we both lose everything." Jasmine signed, and as the ink dried on the last page, she realized she wasn't a prisoner in this marriage. She was something far more terrifying. She was a queen holding a kingdom's worth of secrets, and the king had just knelt at her feet. The estate sat on 20 acres of manicured grounds an hour north of the city, hidden behind iron gates and ancient oak trees that formed a canopy over the private drive. Jasmine had expected a fortress, cold marble, surveillance cameras, the sterile perfection of a man who dealt in shadows and threats. What she found instead was something that stole her breath. The main house was Mediterranean revival, all warm terracotta and arched windows that caught the late afternoon light and turned it to honey. Bougainvillea climbed the walls in cascades of deep purple. A sculpture garden stretched along the eastern wing, bronze and stone figures emerging from perfectly trimmed hedges. And through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the great room, she could see walls lined with art. Not the generic pieces wealthy men bought for investment, but real art. A Rothko that pulsed with color, a small Picasso sketch. Abstract pieces she didn't recognize but could feel in her chest. "You collect," Jasmine said, her voice barely above a whisper. She stood in the center of the foyer, still wearing the wedding gown that now felt like a costume from another life, and tried to reconcile the man who had commanded her wedding with the space that suggested taste and patience and something dangerously close to a soul. "My mother collected," Dante corrected, shrugging out of his suit jacket and draping it over a leather chair. He'd dismissed the lawyers and the security team at the gate, and now it was just the two of them in this beautiful, impossible house. She believed that power without culture was just violence with money. I inherited her collection and her philosophy. He moved through the space with the easy grace of someone who belonged here, not like a king surveying his domain, but like a man who'd finally come home. "Come, there's something you need to see." Jasmine followed because she didn't know what else to do. Her heels clicked against Italian tile, then went silent on Persian rugs that were probably older than she was. Dante led her through the great room, past a chef's kitchen that looked barely used, down a corridor lined with photographs, black and white images of people she didn't recognize but who had Dante's eyes, his bone structure, his intensity. He stopped at a set of double doors at the end of the west wing and pushed them open without ceremony. Light flooded in from floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the gardens. The room was massive, easily 2,000 square feet, with exposed wooden beams and skylights that turned the space into a cathedral of natural illumination. But it was what filled the room that made Jasmine's knees go weak. Cutting tables, industrial grade, dress forms in every size, positioned like silent sentinels. Bolts of fabric organized by color and weight on custom shelving that ran the length of one wall. A sewing station with equipment she'd only dreamed of owning. And in the corner, a vintage drafting table with pristine paper and a set of charcoal pencils arranged with careful precision. "You made me a studio," Jasmine breathed, and her hand flew to her mouth because she was going to cry again, and she'd promised herself she was done crying. "I had it prepared 3 months ago," Dante said, and his voice was carefully neutral, like he was trying not to spook a wild animal. "When I realized what Philip was planning, I knew you'd need a space to rebuild." He walked to the fabric wall and ran his hand along a bolt of champagne silk that probably cost thousands of dollars per yard. "The materials are yours. The equipment is yours. This room is yours. No one enters without your permission, not even me." Jasmine turned to face him, her amber eyes searching his face for the angle, the trap, the hidden cost of this impossible gift. "Why would you do this? You don't even know me. I'm just a—" She stopped, because she didn't know what she was anymore. Not a bride, not a victim. Something new and undefined and terrifying. "You're not just anything," Dante said, and there was an edge to his voice now, something sharp beneath the careful control. "You're the CEO of Mansion Couture. You're the woman who rebuilt a dying legacy brand into something that every designer on the East Coast envies. You're the only person Philip couldn't break even when he tried." He moved closer, and Jasmine's breath caught because his presence filled the space between them like a physical thing. "Do you know why I care about fashion, Jasmine? Why a man who deals in shipping containers and port manifests would pay attention to your business?" "No," she whispered, because her voice wouldn't go any louder. "Because I own the entire supply chain you rely on," Dante said, and his eyes held hers with an intensity that made her feel pinned. "Every bolt of silk from China, every shipment of Italian leather, every container of specialty buttons and French lace, they all move through my ports, on my ships, through my warehouses. For the last 4 years, I've made sure your materials arrived exactly when you needed them. And I made sure your competitors' shipments got delayed in customs, lost in transit, damaged by accidents that were never quite investigated." A dangerous smile touched his lips. "You think you succeeded on talent alone? You did. But I made sure you had the battlefield advantage." Jasmine felt the air leave her lungs. "You've been manipulating my business. I've been ensuring your success," Dante corrected. "There's a difference. I respect you, Jasmine. You understand something most designers don't, that fashion isn't just about creativity. It's about logistics, timing, supply chain management. You've never missed a deadline because you understand that art dies without infrastructure. That's why I invested in you. That's why I'm here." He took one step closer, close enough that she could feel the heat of him, smell the sandalwood and tobacco that clung to his skin. "Philip saw you as a vault to crack. I see you as a queen who just needs an army." The room suddenly felt too small, too warm, despite its cathedral ceilings and wall of windows. Jasmine's pulse hammered in her throat, and she didn't know if it was fear or fury or something far more dangerous. "I don't need saving," she managed. "I know," Dante said simply. That's why I chose you." That night, Jasmine discovered her bedroom was connected to Dante's by an adjoining door. Not locked, not barricaded, just a simple door with an antique brass handle that turned easily when she tested it out of curiosity she wouldn't admit to. Her room was stunning, a 4-poster bed draped in white linen, a balcony overlooking the gardens, a bathroom with a clawfoot tub deep enough to drown in. Someone had unpacked her overnight bag, the one Bonnie must have grabbed from the bridal suite at the estate. Her clothes hung in a walk-in closet that was 3 times the size of her apartment bedroom. She'd just stepped out of the shower, wrapped in a towel with her dark hair dripping down her back, when she heard the knock. 3 sharp raps, then Dante's voice. "Jasmine, I'm coming in. You're decent, I hope." He didn't wait for an answer. The adjoining door opened, and he stood there in the threshold, still wearing his dress pants but his shirt unbuttoned, revealing the geometric tattoos that covered his chest, intricate lines and angles that formed a pattern she still couldn't decipher. In his hand was a sleek black phone. "You need this," he said. His eyes doing something complicated, looking at her without quite looking at her, respecting the towel and the vulnerability it represented while still managing to see everything. "Secure line. Untraceable. Your contacts are already loaded." He crossed the room in 3 strides, and suddenly he was too close, invading her space in a way that should have felt threatening but instead felt like a promise. He held out the phone, and when she reached for it, his fingers brushed hers. The contact was electric, and she saw his jaw tighten in response. "Thank you," Jasmine whispered, because her voice had abandoned her somewhere between the shower and this moment. A drop of water slid from her hair down her neck, and she watched Dante's eyes track its path before he visibly forced his gaze back to her face. "Your dress," he said, his voice rougher now. "The strap is." He reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder where the towel had slipped, and for one heart-stopping moment she thought he was going to touch her bare skin. Instead, he carefully, gently adjusted the edge of the towel, his knuckles barely grazing her collarbone. The touch lasted less than a second, but it seared through her like a brand. The heat between them was unbearable, a living thing that made the air thick and hard to breathe. Then Dante stepped back, putting careful distance between them, his hands curling into fists at his sides like he was physically restraining himself. "I don't take what isn't offered, Jasmine," he said, and his voice was dark velvet wrapped around steel. "I wait." He turned and walked back through the adjoining door, closing it behind him with a soft click that sounded like a promise and a threat all at once. Jasmine stood there for a long moment, the phone forgotten in her hand, her skin still burning where he'd almost touched her. Then she moved to his side of the room, opened his closet without permission, and took one of his shirts, soft cotton that smelled like him. She put it on, letting it fall to mid-thigh, and climbed into the massive bed. For the first time in 2 years, she felt safe, and that terrified her more than anything Philip had ever done. 3 days passed in a strange rhythm of avoidance and proximity. Jasmine spent her mornings in the studio Dante had built for her, sketching new designs with a fury that surprised her. The designs were different now, darker, sharper, infused with an edge she'd never allowed herself before. Her afternoons were consumed by phone calls with lawyers who spoke in careful tones about asset recovery and injunctions. Philip's jet had been grounded in Montreal. The sale to Laurent Mercier was being contested. Mansion Couture's accounts were slowly being unfrozen. She was winning, piece by piece, and it felt like breathing after drowning. But the estate itself felt like a gilded cage lined with security guards who nodded politely as she passed and surveillance cameras hidden in the eaves. Dante was everywhere and nowhere, his presence, a constant hum beneath the surface of her new life. But the man himself remained frustratingly absent, until the night she saw him in the garden. Jasmine couldn't sleep. The bed was too soft, the silence too complete, and her mind wouldn't stop replaying the moment Dante had adjusted her towel with those scarred hands that had trembled with restraint. She'd pulled on a silk robe over the t-shirt she'd stolen from his closet and wandered downstairs, drawn by the sound of voices drifting through the open terrace doors. The garden was illuminated by soft landscape lighting that turned the pathways into rivers of gold, and there, beneath the pergola wrapped in jasmine vines, was Dante. He wasn't alone. A woman stood with him, young and beautiful, with dark hair that cascaded down her back and a face wet with tears that caught the light. She was speaking rapidly in Italian, her hands gesturing wildly, and Dante was holding her face between his palms, his expression soft in a way Jasmine had never seen. Tender, protective, intimate. The jealousy hit Jasmine like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs and leaving something acidic in its wake. She stepped back into the shadows of the house, her hand pressed against her mouth, feeling like the fool she'd sworn she'd never be again. Of course there was someone else. Men like Dante didn't marry for love. They married for strategy, for power, for convenience. And the real relationship happened in shadowed gardens where security cameras didn't reach. She'd been so stupid to think the shirt meant something, that the restraint in his touch was desire rather than simple disinterest. Philip had taught her that lesson already. Apparently she was a slow learner. At dinner the next evening, Jasmine was ice. She sat across from Dante at the massive dining table, picking at food she couldn't taste, answering his questions in monosyllables. "How is the studio?" he asked. "Fine," she replied. "The lawyers called. They're making progress. Good." The silence between them stretched taut as a wire, and she could feel him studying her with those dark, unreadable eyes. Finally, he set down his fork with deliberate precision. "What happened?" Dante's voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath it. "You've been avoiding me for 2 days. Now you're sitting at my table radiating hostility. Tell me what I did." "Nothing," Jasmine said, and hated how brittle her voice sounded. "You did nothing. That's the point, isn't it? This is a business arrangement. I shouldn't expect." She stopped because her throat was closing and she refused to cry in front of him again. Dante stood, his chair scraping against the floor, and rounded the table before she could react. He pulled out her chair and offered his hand. "Come with me." It wasn't a request. Jasmine let him lead her through the house, out into the garden, down a path she hadn't explored before. They stopped at a small guest house hidden behind a wall of climbing roses. Dante knocked twice, then opened the door without waiting for an answer. Inside, the beautiful woman from the garden sat curled on a sofa, a book in her lap. She looked up when they entered, and her tear-streaked face broke into a tentative smile. "Julia," Dante said, his voice gentling in a way that made Jasmine's chest ache. "This is Jasmine, my wife. Jasmine, this is my sister." The word sister hit Jasmine like cold water. She stared at the young woman barely 20, with Dante's dark eyes and delicate features softened by youth, and felt the shame rise hot in her cheeks. "Your sister," she repeated stupidly. Dante's jaw tightened. "I've kept her here since our father died. There's a rival family, the Costellos, who would use her to get to me. She's safer here, hidden, than anywhere else in the world." He looked at Julia with such fierce protectiveness that Jasmine finally understood. This was what safety looked like to Dante. Not locked doors, but invisible walls. Not isolation, but strategic distance. "I saw you in the garden," Jasmine admitted, her voice small. "I thought..." She couldn't finish. Dante's eyes flashed with something that might have been hurt. "You thought I'd marry you and keep a mistress 10 feet from your bedroom?" He moved closer, close enough that she could smell sandalwood and the faint trace of wine on his breath. "I told you, I don't take what isn't offered." Julia watched them with wide eyes, then smiled. "He talks about you constantly. It's annoying." Jasmine felt something crack open in her chest. She turned to the younger woman, seeing the loneliness in her eyes that mirrored her own. "Would you let me design something for you? A dress, maybe. Something that makes you feel less like you're hiding." Dante's hand found the small of Jasmine's back, the touch burning through the thin fabric of her dress. She watched as he looked between her and his sister, and something in his expression shifted gratitude and desire and something darker she couldn't name. Later, when they walked back to the main house under a sky full of stars, Dante stopped her at the door. He cupped her face the way he'd held Julia's, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones, and pressed his lips to her forehead in a kiss that felt like a vow. "I protect what is mine," he murmured against her skin. "You. Her. Always." And Jasmine believed him. The package arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier service that didn't ask for a signature. Jasmine found it on the entry hall table where the staff left incoming mail, a plain brown box with her name written in Philip's familiar handwriting. Her stomach turned. She carried it to her studio and locked the door before opening it, some instinct telling her this required privacy. Inside was a handwritten note on expensive cardstock, and a small hard drive labeled in red ink, "The truth about Pisani." The note was brief, almost clinical. "Jasmine, I know you're angry, but you need to understand what you've gotten yourself into. Dante Pisani is not who you think he is. This drive contains evidence of his real business, the murders, the trafficking, the violence he's hidden from you. I'm sending this because despite everything, I still care about your safety. Watch it, then run. Philip." Jasmine's hands shook as she held the drive. Part of her wanted to throw it away, to trust the man who'd given her a studio and protected his sister and kissed her forehead like a promise. But another part, the part that had been betrayed so thoroughly she'd become a cautionary tale, needed to know the truth. She plugged the drive into her laptop with fingers that felt numb and clicked the single video file. The screen flickered to black, then burst into grainy footage of what looked like a hotel suite. Her breath caught, but it wasn't Dante on the screen. It was Philip, disheveled and drunk, surrounded by men in expensive suits who were laughing too loud. A bachelor party. His bachelor party. The timestamp showed it was 3 nights before the wedding. Honestly, Philip was saying, his words slurring slightly as he gestured with a tumbler of whiskey. The hardest part was pretending to find her attractive. Have you seen her hips? I mean, she photographs well, but in person. The men laughed, and Jasmine felt bile rise in her throat. Philip continued, warming to his audience. And she's so uptight about business decisions. I had to start slipping half an Ambien into her wine during negotiations just to make her agreeable enough to sign things. Made her pliable. He grinned, proud of his cleverness. She probably still thinks she made those partnership decisions on her own. The room spun. Jasmine's vision tunneled to the screen, where Philip was demonstrating how she'd slurred her words after the business dinners he'd insisted on, and his friends were howling with laughter. He'd drugged her. For months. And she'd never known. The video cut off abruptly, replaced by a single line of text. Your husband's men have been watching Philip longer than you've known him. This is what we found. The original drive contained standard surveillance footage of our operations. We thought you should see what Philip actually is. D. Jasmine barely made it to the bathroom before she was sick. She collapsed on the cool tile floor afterward, her body shaking with sobs that felt like they were tearing her apart from the inside. Every intimate moment with Philip replayed in her mind, now tainted with the knowledge that some of them hadn't been consensual at all. She'd signed contracts she didn't remember, made decisions that felt foggy, trusted him when her body was chemically betrayed. She didn't hear the door open, but suddenly Dante was there, kneeling beside her on the bathroom floor. He didn't ask questions. He simply pulled her into his arms, one hand cradling the back of her head while she shattered against his chest. He drugged me, she managed between sobs. He drugged me and I didn't know, and I thought. Dante's arms tightened around her, and she felt the tension coiling through his body like a living thing. Violence held in check by sheer force of will. I know, he said, his voice rough with barely contained rage. I know, and he will pay for it. Not with blood, I won't give him the mercy of a quick end, but with erasure. I'll take everything he has, everything he is, until no one remembers his name. That night, Jasmine couldn't bear to be alone. She asked Dante to stay, her voice small and broken, and he pulled a chair to the corner of her room without hesitation. She fell asleep watching his silhouette against the window, a silent guardian between her and a world that had proven itself cruel. When she woke in the gray light of dawn, he was still there, his eyes on the door, keeping watch like he'd promised. Always. 2 weeks after Philip's poisoned gift, Jasmine stood in her reclaimed design studio in the heart of Manhattan's garment district. The space felt like hers again. Her team of 6 designers hunched over cutting tables, the hum of industrial sewing machines creating a rhythm that felt like home. Dante's lawyers had worked miracles, breaking Philip's asset freeze and restoring her access to the archive. She'd spent the morning reviewing fabric samples for the spring collection, her confidence rebuilding with every decision she made without second-guessing herself. For the first time since the wedding that wasn't a wedding, she felt like herself. Powerful. In control. Whole. Then the doors exploded inward. FBI! Nobody move. 6 men in tactical gear stormed through the entrance, weapons drawn, voices sharp with authority. Her design team screamed. Jasmine's assistant dropped a bolt of silk that unfurled across the floor like spilled blood. 2 agents grabbed Jasmine by her arms, forcing her away from her desk, away from her staff, into the small office at the back. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might crack through bone. This was it. Dante's world had finally caught up to her. The marriage, the merger, the protection. It had all been a beautiful lie, and now she would pay the price. Mrs. Pisani, the lead agent said, his face hidden behind dark glasses and a tactical vest. We need to ask you about your husband's business operations. His voice was cold, professional, and it made her blood run ice. What do you know about his shipping operations? The port holdings? The offshore accounts? Jasmine's mind raced. She thought about the papers she'd signed, the assets in her name, the kingdom Dante had placed at her feet. She thought about Julia hidden in the guest house. She thought about the way Dante had held her while she'd shattered on the bathroom floor, and she realized with crystalline clarity that she would burn before she betrayed him. "My husband," she said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat, "is a legitimate businessman. He owns shipping infrastructure. That's not a crime." The agent leaned closer. "We have evidence suggesting otherwise. Money laundering, racketeering. If you cooperate now, we can protect you." Jasmine lifted her chin, her amber eyes blazing. "I don't need protection from my husband. I need protection from men who break into my studio and terrorize my employees. Get out." The agent stared at her for a long moment, then tapped his earpiece. "Clear," he said, and his tone shifted completely. The tension drained from the room like water through a sieve. The office door opened. Dante walked in, still wearing his charcoal suit from whatever meeting he'd been in, and the fake agent stepped aside like he was royalty. Jasmine's knees went weak. It was a test, she breathed, and the relief that flooded through her turned instantly to white-hot fury. "You staged a raid? You terrified me, terrified my staff, to test my loyalty?" She moved before thought could catch up, her palm connecting with his chest in a slap that echoed through the small space. "How dare you?" "Oh," Dante caught her wrists before she could strike again, his grip firm but not painful, and pulled her close enough that she could see her own reflection in his dark eyes. "There was a credible threat," he said, his voice rough, and she could feel him trembling not with anger but with something that looked dangerously like fear. "Someone leaked your location. I needed to know if your security protocols would hold. If you would hold." His hand slid from her wrists to her face, cradling her jaw with a tenderness that contradicted the intensity in his eyes. "I had to know you were safe. I can't lose you, Jasmine. I won't survive it." The anger in her chest twisted into something else, something molten and consuming. She realized in that moment that his obsession with her safety wasn't control. It was devotion wrapped in desperation. It was madness, beautiful and terrible, and God help her, she loved it. She loved him. The thunderstorm hit the estate just after sunset, turning the sky from gold to bruised purple in minutes. Rain lashed against the windows of the library, creating a percussion that made the space feel smaller, more intimate, like the world had contracted to just this room and the two of them within it. Jasmine sat curled in the leather wingback chair near the fireplace, a sketchpad balanced on her knees, charcoal smudging her fingers as she worked on designs for Julia's dress. Dante occupied the sofa across from her, a book in his hands, something in Italian she couldn't read, his reading glasses perched on his nose in a way that made him look less dangerous and more human. The domesticity of the moment hit her like a physical thing. This was what marriage looked like when it wasn't performance or strategy. This quiet coexistence, this comfortable silence broken only by the crack of thunder and the whisper of turning pages. "You're staring," Dante said without looking up from his book. But she could see the hint of a smile playing at his lips. Jasmine felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm studying," she corrected, setting down her charcoal. "The tattoo on your neck. I've been wondering about it since the wedding. What does it mean?" Dante closed his book slowly, deliberately, and set it aside. He unbuttoned the top 3 buttons of his shirt, revealing more of the geometric ink that covered his chest, intricate lines and angles that formed a pattern she'd never been able to fully decipher. "Come here," he said, his voice low, and it wasn't a command so much as an invitation. Jasmine rose and crossed to him, her bare feet silent on the Persian rug. She knelt on the sofa beside him, close enough to smell the sandalwood and rain that clung to his skin, and reached out to trace the tattoo with one tentative finger. The ink was warm beneath her touch, the lines so precise they looked machine-made rather than hand-drawn. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "What is it?" Dante caught her hand, pressing her palm flat against his chest, where she could feel his heart beating hard and fast despite his calm exterior. "It's the crest of the Old World Guild," he said. "An alliance formed 3 generations ago between families who controlled trade routes across Europe. My grandfather was one of the founding members." He paused, his dark eyes searching her face. "Your grandmother was another." Jasmine's breath caught. "That's impossible. My grandmother never mentioned." Then she stopped, because she was remembering the locket. The antique gold locket her grandmother had worn every day until she died. The one that now sat in Jasmine's jewelry box because she couldn't bear to open it after the funeral. "Wait here," she said, and ran from the library before Dante could respond. She returned 3 minutes later, breathless, the locket clutched in her trembling hand. She opened it with fingers that felt numb, and there it was, etched into the inside of the gold casing, the same geometric pattern that marked Dante's skin, the same crest. "We're bound." Dante said quietly. Not by law or contract, but by blood oath. My grandfather swore to protect the mansion bloodline. When your grandmother died and you inherited the company, that oath passed to me. I've been watching you for 5 years. Jasmine, making sure your shipments arrived on time, keeping your competitors at bay, waiting for the moment you'd need me. His voice dropped lower. I didn't expect to fall in love with you. 5 years? Jasmine's mind was reeling. We've never met before the wedding. Dante reached out and traced the numbers tattooed below the crest on his chest. These are coordinates, he said. 40.7581 north, 73.9855 west. The New York Public Library, main reading room. 5 years ago, you were there researching textile patents. You dropped a book. I picked it up and handed it to you. You smiled and said thank you. It took 3 seconds. You forgot. I never did. Jasmine remembered. God help her, she remembered. A stranger in an expensive suit. Dark eyes that had held hers for just a moment before she'd rushed back to her table. Too overwhelmed with grief and responsibility to notice the way he'd watched her leave. You've loved me for 5 years, she breathed, and it wasn't a question. The storm outside reached a crescendo, thunder shaking the windows, and the firelight painted Dante's face in shadows and gold. Since the moment you smiled at me, he confirmed. Since before you knew what grief looked like. Since before Philip. Since before everything fell apart. I've been yours, Jasmine. I just had to wait for you to be ready to claim me. Something inside her broke open, not shattered, but bloomed, like a flower finally finding sunlight after years in darkness. She realized that every careful touch, every restrained moment, every night he'd slept in a chair watching her door, it had all been love. Patient, devoted, unwavering love. Jasmine moved before she could overthink it, closing the distance between them until she was straddling his lap, her hands framing his face, her forehead pressed to his. I'm ready now, she whispered against his lips. I'm claiming you now. Dante's control, that iron restraint he'd maintained for weeks, finally snapped. His hands found her waist, her back, threading through her hair as he pulled her closer. The kiss was fire and devotion and 5 years of waiting, condensed into a single moment that felt like both an ending and a beginning. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, they built a different kind of tempest, one made of touch and trust, and the terrifying beauty of being truly seen. Later, when the fire had burned down to embers and the rain had softened to a whisper, Jasmine would trace the coordinates on his chest one more time and understand. They weren't random numbers. They were a promise, a declaration. The exact moment and place where his world had shifted on its axis, and her face had become the only constellation he needed to navigate by. Paris Fashion Week arrived like Vindication wrapped in spotlights and champagne. Jasmine stood backstage at the Carrousel du Louvre, surrounded by organized chaos models in various states of undress. Makeup artists doing final touch-ups, her design team making last-minute adjustments to hems and seams. The collection she'd created in those desperate weeks after the wedding was her best work. Dark, edgy, powerful. Every piece told a story of survival and resurrection. The venue was packed with every name that mattered in fashion editors from Vogue and Harper's Bazaar, buyers from Bergdorf and Harrods, influencers whose single Instagram post could make or break a career. This was her comeback, her redemption. The moment the industry would remember that Jasmine Mansion was not a victim, but a force of nature. Then Bonnie burst through the backstage curtain, her face pale. Jas, we have a problem. Philip's here. Jasmine's blood went cold. She moved to the edge of the curtain and peered out. There, at the venue entrance, was Philip, surrounded by private security and a cluster of photographers he'd clearly alerted himself. He wore an expensive suit and an expression of righteous indignation that made her stomach turn. His voice carried across the space, amplified by the reporters shoving microphones at him. The mansion name belongs to me through contractual acquisition. This show is illegal. I'm here to shut it down and protect my intellectual property. Jasmine felt rage surge through her veins. She moved toward the curtain, ready to face him, ready to destroy him with words if necessary. But Dante's hand found the small of her back, warm and grounding. He'd been sitting in the front row, but now he stood beside her in the wings, immaculate in a black suit that made him look like an elegant predator. Watch, he murmured in her ear, his breath warm against her skin. This is my gift to you. Then he was moving through the crowd with that same lethal grace she'd first seen at the botanical estate. The audience parted for him instinctively, sensing danger in a way humans always could when apex predators entered their territory. Dante stopped 3 feet from Philip, close enough that the cameras caught every moment of the confrontation. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply reached into his jacket and withdrew a single manila envelope, extending it toward Philip with the casual courtesy of someone offering directions. "You should read this before you continue," Dante said, his voice carrying despite its quietness. Philip snatched the envelope, his bravado faltering as he scanned the contents. Jasmine watched his face drain of color, watched his hands begin to shake, watched the exact moment he understood he'd been checkmated. "This is impossible," Philip stammered. I never." But Dante was already speaking, addressing the reporters with the kind of authority that made them lean in rather than interrupt. "Mr. Ellison has been under investigation by the FBI and IRS for the past 6 months, due to the asset freeze I initiated after my wedding, and the subsequent transfer of certain accounts, Mr. Initiated. Ellison has unknowingly been laundering money for several criminal organizations. The evidence is comprehensive. The warrants are active." As if on cue, real federal agents materialized from the edges of the venue, not the fake ones from Dante's stress test, but genuine authorities with badges and grim expressions. They moved on Philip with professional efficiency, separating him from his security, cuffing his wrists, while reading him his rights. The photographers went wild, flashbulbs exploding like small bombs. Philip's eyes found Jasmine through the crowd, and she saw the moment he realized she'd been part of this, that she'd helped orchestrate his downfall. "You set me up," he mouthed, and she smiled. Cold, victorious, beautiful. 30 minutes later, after Philip had been escorted away and the venue had erupted into excited chatter, Jasmine's show began. The lights dimmed. Music swelled. Her models walked the runway like warriors in silk and leather, each piece a declaration that beauty could be armor and femininity could be power. Jasmine watched from the wings, her heart hammering, as the collection she'd bled for unfolded in front of the world. And when the final model made her exit, when it was time for the designer to take her bow, Jasmine walked out onto that runway feeling like she was walking into her own coronation. The applause was deafening, but she didn't hear it. She walked to the end of the runway, to where the photographers clustered and the lights were brightest, and her eyes found Dante in the front row. He wasn't applauding. He was simply watching her with an expression that made her knees weak, pride and possession and love so fierce it felt like its own form of devotion. The crowd was cheering for her designs, for her comeback, for the story of the designer who'd risen from public humiliation to triumph. But Jasmine only saw him, the man who'd built this stage for her, who'd given her the weapons and stepped back to let her fight her own war. She thought about Philip's parting words, "You set me up," and realized he still didn't understand. Dante hadn't set Philip up. Philip had destroyed himself with his own greed and cruelty. Dante had simply ensured justice arrived wearing inevitability instead of mercy. Philip had stolen her light, tried to snuff it out and claim it for himself. But Dante had built her a stage where that light could burn brighter than ever before. As she took her final bow, as the crowd rose to their feet, Jasmine knew with crystalline certainty this was only the beginning of her reign. 3 months after Paris Fashion Week, on the exact anniversary of the day Dante had stepped onto a white carpet and claimed her as his own, Jasmine found herself in Venice. Not the tourist Venice of crowded piazzas and overpriced gondolas, but the Venice that belonged to old money and older secrets, a private palazzo on the Grand Canal that had been in Dante's family for generations. They'd arrived that afternoon by private boat, and now sat on the terrace overlooking water that reflected the sunset in shades of rose gold and burning amber. Dinner had been perfect, intimate, and quiet, just the two of them and the soft lap of water against ancient stone. Mansion Couture was thriving beyond her wildest projections. Philip was serving 18 months in a minimum security facility for financial crimes, his name a punchline in industry circles. Julia had started university in Milan, wearing the dress Jasmine had designed for her like armor against a world that no longer frightened her. Everything Dante had promised that day in the botanical estate had come true. She had her company, her freedom, her future. She should have felt complete. But when Dante reached into his jacket and withdrew a cream-colored envelope, setting it on the table between them with careful precision, Jasmine's heart stuttered in her chest. She knew before he spoke what it contained. She could see it in the tension of his shoulders, in the way his dark eyes wouldn't quite meet hers. "Open it," he said quietly, and his voice carried the weight of something that sounded dangerously close to goodbye. Jasmine's hands trembled as she lifted the envelope. Inside were papers, legal documents with their names printed in formal typeface. Annulment papers, signed by him, requiring only her signature to dissolve their marriage as if it had never existed. I don't understand, she whispered. But that was a lie. She understood perfectly, and it was breaking her heart. The merger is complete, Dante said, and he was using his business voice, the one that was all cold strategy and careful distance. Philip is destroyed. You have your company, your money, your freedom. The contract is fulfilled. You aren't bound to me anymore, Jasmine. You never were. He leaned forward, and candlelight caught the geometric tattoo on his neck, the coordinates that marked where their story had truly begun 5 years ago, in a library she'd forgotten. I enforced the merger. I gave you the weapons to fight your war, but I won't keep you in a marriage you entered out of desperation. Sign the papers. Walk away. Build the life you deserve without the weight of obligations you never chose. The words hit her like physical blows. He thought she'd stayed because she had to. Because of contracts and asset transfers and strategic necessity. He thought the nights she'd spent in his arms, the mornings she'd woken to find him watching her like she was something precious, the quiet domesticity of shared library evenings. He thought all of it had been gratitude, masquerading as affection. He'd given her everything, and convinced himself she'd given him nothing in return. Jasmine stood up so quickly her chair scraped against the terrace stone. She picked up the annulment papers with shaking hands, and for one terrible moment, Dante's face went carefully blank, bracing for the signature that would end them. Instead, Jasmine tore the papers in half, then in half again. And again. She let the pieces flutter from her hands, watching them fall like snow into the dark water of the canal below, where they dissolved into nothing. You're right about one thing, Jasmine said, and her voice shook with fury and love and something so fierce it felt like its own form of devotion. You forced the merger, Dante. You stepped into the worst moment of my life and offered me a way out when I had nothing. But you earned the wife. She moved around the table, grabbed the lapels of his perfectly tailored suit, and pulled him to his feet. Every night you sat watch in my room. Every time you touched me like I was something breakable and precious. Every time you gave me power instead of taking it. Every time you built me a stage instead of keeping me in a cage. You earned this. You earned me. Tears were streaming down her face now, but she didn't care. I'm not staying for the contract. I'm not staying because of assets or strategy or obligation. I'm staying because I love you. Because you've loved me since before I knew what love looked like. Because when I think about my future, every version of it has your face. Dante's control shattered. He caught her face between his hands, his thumbs wiping away her tears, and kissed her with a desperation that tasted like relief and fear and hope all tangled together. I was so afraid, he whispered against her lips, that you'd sign them, that you'd leave, that I'd lose you after finally having you. Jasmine smiled through her tears. You can't lose something that's already yours. I've been yours since the moment you said, the groom is irrelevant. Maybe longer. Maybe since that day in the library when I dropped a book and a stranger with dark eyes picked it up like it was the most important thing in the world. 6 months later, Jasmine stood in a vineyard in Tuscany, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her stomach, watching the sun set over endless rows of grapevines. Dante had bought the property as a wedding gift, their real wedding, the one they'd had in the estate's garden with only Julia and Bonnie as witnesses, where the vows had been their own words and the rings had been chosen together. The vineyard wasn't an investment or a strategic acquisition. It was a home, a kingdom they would rule together, raising grapes and children and an empire built on trust instead of contracts. Dante came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, his hands covering hers over their unborn child. What are you thinking about? He murmured against her hair. Jasmine leaned back into his warmth, feeling safer and more powerful than she'd ever imagined possible. That Philip tried to steal my light, but you built me a stage where it could burn brighter than ever. That I thought I was marrying a stranger out of desperation, but I was really choosing the man who'd been loving me from the shadows for 5 years, waiting for me to be ready to love him back. She turned in his arms, her amber eyes meeting his dark ones. That this, us, this life, this love, is the greatest design I'll ever create. If you loved Jasmine and Dante's dark fairy tale, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories where the villain becomes the hero and broken brides become queens. What would you do if your groom left you at the aisle? Would you take the hand of a dangerous stranger? Let us know in the comments below. Until next time, remember that sometimes the best love stories begin at the worst moments, and the person who saves you might just be the one you were always meant to save in return.